In the small, seemingly forgotten town of Elmview, strange occurrences were no stranger to the locals. Yet, none could anticipate the chilling turn of events that the arrival of an ominous old train would bring. It was a foggy evening when the ancient locomotive, absent from any known schedule, screeched to a halt at the town's dilapidated station. Its blackened, rusted exterior suggested it had journeyed through time itself, a relic from an era long past. As the townsfolk gathered around the mysterious train, an unsettling silence fell. The doors creaked open, yet no one disembarked. The crowd's curiosity turned into concern as a cold wind swept through, carrying whispers of the past, tales of those who had vanished without a trace decades ago. Among the crowd was young Thomas, a local high school student with a keen interest in Elmview's history, particularly its myths and ghost stories. Driven by a mixture of fear and fascination, Thomas stepped forward, his heart pounding as he crossed the threshold into the dimly lit carriage. Inside, the train was unlike any he had read about. The wooden seats were covered in thick dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like drapes. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. As Thomas ventured deeper, the train seemed to groan under its own weight, as if protesting the new presence. Suddenly the train jolted, causing Thomas to stumble. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the corroded walls. A whisper echoed through the compartment, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. "Find us, set us free." Compelled by the voice, Thomas found himself drawn to the end of the carriage, where he discovered a hidden compartment. Inside, there lay a collection of old, tattered journals bound in leather. As he flipped through the yellowed pages, he realized they were diaries belonging to the passengers who had disappeared on the train's last recorded journey in 1923. Each entry detailed daily activities, thoughts, and fears, becoming increasingly frantic as the dates drew closer to their sudden cessation. One entry in particular caught his eye, written in a hurried, shaky script. "Something is wrong with the train. It moves even when it should not. The landscape outside never changes, and the others are beginning to vanish, one by one. I fear I may be next." Chilled to the bone, Thomas clutched the journal to his chest. The train's lights dimmed as if on cue, and the whispers grew louder, more desperate. "Help us, please." As the train lurched forward, seemingly setting itself back in motion, Thomas realized with horror that he was no longer alone. Figures, translucent and sorrowful, began to materialize in the seats around him. They were the passengers, forever trapped in their final moments, bound to the phantom train. The doors had sealed. The windows resisted his attempts to open them. Thomas knew he had to uncover the truth behind the train's mysterious journey and the fate of its passengers if he hoped to escape their spectral prison. With the journals as his guide, Thomas prepared to delve deeper into the history and horrors of the train, unaware of the dark secrets that lay buried in the heart of Elmview. His journey was just beginning, and survival was far from guaranteed. As the train plunged into the darkness outside the limits of Elmview, the town faded into the mist, and with it any hope of a normal life for Thomas. The train, like a beast awakened, thundered through the night, carrying its new passenger towards a destiny intertwined with the lost souls crying out for salvation. The train thundered through an unending night, its wheels clattering against the tracks with a relentless, haunting rhythm. Thomas sat frozen in the dimly lit carriage, surrounded by the spectral figures of passengers whose lives had been mysteriously cut short decades ago. The air was thick with a palpable sense of despair, the sorrow of the lost souls weighing heavily in the atmosphere. As the train curved through an unseen landscape, Thomas tried to focus on the journals. The entries became increasingly erratic, the handwriting more desperate. The passengers spoke of visions and nightmares bleeding into their waking hours, of shadows that whispered secrets in the dark, and of a creeping madness that took root in their minds. One journal caught Thomas's attention, its cover more worn than the others. It belonged to Eleanor, a young woman who had been traveling to start a new life when she vanished. Her entries started optimistically but soon spiraled into terror. Each night they come closer, the shadows at the edge of my vision. I hear them calling my name, a chorus of voices so sad and lost. I feel their touch, cold as the grave, pulling at my soul. I dare not sleep, for in sleep they beckon me to join them in their eternal wandering. Determined to uncover the secret of the train and to find a way to release these trapped spirits, Thomas delved deeper into the carriage. As he moved, the temperature dropped, the air growing colder with each step. The lights flickered more violently, as if reacting to his intentions. Suddenly, a loud shriek pierced the silence. Thomas spun around, his heart racing. A ghostly figure stood in the aisle, her spectral form more solid than the others, her expression twisted in a silent scream. It was Eleanor. Her eyes, hollow and filled with endless sorrow, met his. She pointed towards the back of the train, her mouth moving in a silent plea. Following her direction, Thomas pushed through the oppressive fear that clutched at his chest. He reached the last carriage, where the air felt charged, electric. The whispers were louder here, a cacophony of voices that made his head throb with their intensity. In the center of the carriage sat an old, iron-bound chest, its surface etched with strange, swirling symbols that seemed to move in the flickering light. A heavy padlock secured it, its key nowhere in sight. The ghosts circled the chest, their forms blurring, merging into a vortex of spectral energy. Thomas remembered a passage from one of the journals about a key that unlocked the darkness and set the shadows free. He realized that the key must be somewhere on the train, hidden away, perhaps meant never to be found. As he turned to search, the train gave a sudden violent lurch, throwing him to the floor. A deep, dark laugh echoed through the train, a sound that was neither human nor kind. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the windows. Shadows detached from the corners, forming shapes that were almost human, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his breath visible in the icy air. The shadows advanced, their forms undulating and coalescing into taller, darker figures. The air became suffocating, filled with the stench of decay and the overwhelming power of unbridled malice. He knew he had to find the key. It was the only way to end the nightmare, to release the souls and perhaps save himself. With each step, the shadows whispered his fate, their voices a mix of dread and anticipation. As Thomas searched frantically for the key, he could feel the darkness closing in, eager to claim him as one of its own. The fight for his soul had just begun, and the horrors of the night were far from over. The train, like a beast of prey, hurtled through the darkness, an echo of despair that seemed to have no end. The relentless advance of the shadows filled the narrow train corridor, their forms shifting and contorting into grotesque parodies of human figures. The air grew icy cold, and Thomas's breath turned to mist as he pushed through the oppressive darkness. Each step felt like moving against a tide, the malevolent force of the train trying to ensnare him in its eternal journey. In his hands, the journal of Eleanor trembled, the pages flipping as if guided by an unseen hand to a specific entry. The script, frantic and barely legible, detailed a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the last carriage, the possible location of the mysterious key. With renewed urgency, Thomas darted back towards the end of the train, the cries of the trapped souls echoing around him, their sorrow fueling the chilling atmosphere. Reaching the last carriage, he knelt on the ground, his fingers searching for any outline or crevice that might hint at a hidden space. As his hands moved across the cold metal floor, they brushed against a slightly raised section. With a push, a small panel gave way, revealing a dark cavity below. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, lay an old ornate key. Its handle was shaped like a skull, eyes hollow, giving it a menacing appearance. As Thomas's fingers closed around the key, the train jolted violently, a scream of metal that sounded almost pained, as if the train itself were alive and aware of his intentions. Suddenly the carriages were plunged into darkness, the only light emanating from the phosphorescent glow of the ghosts surrounding him. They stared at him, eyes pleading, silent mouths moving in desperate prayers. Thomas felt the weight of their gazes, their hopes binding him to his task. As he stood, key in hand, the shadows surged forward. They were darker than the surrounding gloom, a void where light seemed to die. Thomas felt a chill deep in his bones, a cold that seemed to seep into his very soul. He clutched the key tighter, its cold metal biting into his palm, and turned towards the chest at the center of the carriage. With each step towards the chest, the shadows whispered threats and promises, voices like knives scraping against his mind. "Turn back," they hissed. "Join us, lost and forgotten," they murmured. But Thomas pushed forward, driven by a resolve that felt beyond his own. Reaching the chest, he slid the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, definitive click. The lid of the chest groaned as he opened it, dust and a rush of air escaping as if it had been sealed for centuries. Inside the chest, there was no treasure, no tangible secret to be uncovered. Instead, there was a blackness that seemed to absorb light, a darkness deeper than anything Thomas had ever seen. It pulsed with a malevolent life of its own, and from within this abyss, a new form began to take shape. A figure, tall and shrouded in tattered robes, rose from the chest. Its face was hidden under a hood, but where eyes should have been, there were only dark voids pulling at Thomas's psyche. A low, resonant voice filled the carriage, coming from the figure, but echoing as if from everywhere and nowhere. "You have freed me," it intoned, the voice chilling Thomas to his core. "But freedom comes at a price. The balance must be maintained. One must stay for one to leave." Thomas reeled back, his mind racing. The ghosts around him began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air, released from their eternal prison, but leaving Thomas with a sinking realization. He had freed the spirits, but in doing so, had he doomed himself to take their place? As the dark figure advanced, the shadows grew dense, weaving around Thomas, binding him to the train that was now his prison. The train howled, a sound of triumph and tragedy intertwined, as it continued its relentless journey through the night, carrying its new captive and an ancient darkness reborn. As the shadows closed in around him, Thomas felt an oppressive weight settle upon his shoulders, a burden far heavier than any physical chain could ever impose. The dark figure stood over him, its presence an abyss that threatened to swallow his very essence. Thomas knew he had to act quickly if he hoped to escape the fate of the souls he had just freed. The train seemed to sense his desperation, its eerie screech merging with the howling winds outside, creating a symphony of dread that echoed through the desolate corridors. The dark figure spoke again, its voice a cold whisper that seemed to seep into Thomas's bones. "You have unleashed me upon the world once more, young one," the figure intoned. "For centuries I was bound by those who knew the dangers of my power. Now you must either bind me again or take my place and become the guardian of this eternal night." Thomas's mind raced. The journals mentioned ancient rites and rituals, hints of a forgotten order that had once contained the dark entity before him. If he could find these texts, perhaps he could rebind the figure or find another way to escape. "I will not be bound to this curse," Thomas declared, his voice trembling not just from fear, but also from a burgeoning resolve. "I will find a way to stop you and end this nightmare for good." The figure laughed, a sound that chilled the air further, causing the glass in the windows to frost over. "Many have tried, young one. All have failed. But I grant you this chance. Seek out the rites if you must, but know that the clock ticks swiftly towards your doom." With a wave of its robed arm, the figure receded into the shadows, merging with the darkness that seemed to permeate every inch of the train. Thomas knew his time was limited. He gathered the journals and searched them frantically for any reference to the ancient rites needed to contain the entity. As he read, the train seemed to pass through a landscape more surreal and terrifying than before. Through the frosted windows, Thomas saw landscapes that defied logic. Twisted, gnarled trees with faces that moaned in the wind. Rivers that flowed not with water, but with a dark, viscous substance that gleamed under an unseen light. Finally, in the oldest of the journals, he found a detailed account of a ritual involving several artifacts: a ring made of a dark, unknown metal, a dagger with a handle shaped like a serpent, and a book of incantations written in a language that twisted the eyes just to look upon it. Thomas looked up from the journal. The items were described as being kept in a hidden compartment in the conductor's cabin, a place shrouded in mystery, as none of the ghostly passengers had mentioned venturing there. With a deep breath, Thomas made his way to the front of the train, each step echoing ominously. The conductor's cabin door was ajar, swinging slightly as if beckoning him inside. He pushed it open, the creak of the hinges like a scream in the silent train. Inside the cabin was a chaos of ancient maps and arcane instruments, their purposes long forgotten. The air was thick with dust, but beneath it, there was the faint scent of something darker, more sinister. Thomas searched desperately, pulling at panels and opening drawers. Finally, under a false bottom in a weathered desk, he found the ring, the dagger, and the book. They were exactly as described in the journal, radiating a malevolent energy that made Thomas's skin crawl. He hesitated, knowing that once he began the ritual, there would be no turning back. As he prepared to take the items, the train gave a sudden, violent jerk, throwing him against the wall. A deep, dark laughter echoed through the cabin, and the dark figure materialized before him once more. "The path you choose is fraught with peril," it warned. "Proceed, and you may lose more than your life." Thomas gripped the items tightly. "I must try," he said, a determination in his voice that surprised even him. "There has to be an end to this, and I will find it." With the artifacts in hand, Thomas prepared to confront the darkness head-on, unaware of the true scale of the forces he was about to contend with. The night was deep, and the train hurtled towards an unknown destination, with Thomas caught between salvation and damnation. With the ancient artifacts clutched in his hands, Thomas's heart pounded as he faced the daunting task ahead. The cabin around him seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes that danced on the periphery of his vision. Despite the encroaching darkness, Thomas set about preparing the ritual that he hoped would banish the dark entity and release him from this nightmarish journey. He spread the old book open on the conductor's desk. The pages were brittle, the text written in an archaic script that twisted unnaturally, as if alive. The ring felt unnaturally heavy in his hand, cold and as dark as the void from which the entity had emerged. The dagger's blade caught the dim light, casting sinister shadows. As he began to read the incantations, a wind whipped through the cabin, the words almost snatched from his lips by the force of the gale that seemed to come from nowhere. The train's lights flickered wildly, as if the very energy of the train was being siphoned into the ritual. Outside, the landscape had turned even more nightmarish. Thomas could see through the windows that the skies had turned a deep, blood red, the clouds swirling in a vortex directly above the train. Lightning flashed, illuminating twisted, writhing figures in the clouds, their forms massive and menacing. The dark figure appeared again, its form now more defined, more terrifying. It was as if the ritual was forcing it into a physical manifestation, binding it to the train as it had bound the souls of the passengers. "You dare to bind what you do not understand, mortal?" The entity boomed, its voice a cacophony that seemed to come from the train itself. "You risk the abyss for a mere chance at salvation." Thomas continued the incantations, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. He placed the ring on the floor of the cabin and drove the dagger into the center, the metal ringing out as it struck the train's floor. The sound was a clear, pure note that seemed to resonate with power vibrating through the air. The entity screamed, a sound that was pain and rage intertwined. The shadows around Thomas grew denser, reaching for him with tendrils of darkness that sapped his strength. He felt his energy waning, his voice growing weaker as he continued the ritual. Just as he felt he might collapse, the ring emitted a bright, blinding light, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The light enveloped the entity, its scream becoming a wail of defeat as it was pulled into the vortex created by the ritual. The train shook violently, a tremor that ran through its very structure as if it were being torn apart. Thomas held on to the desk, his eyes fixed on the ring as the light grew more intense, the shadows being sucked into it like water down a drain. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light snapped out, leaving an echoing silence in its wake. The entity was gone. The oppressive presence that had filled the train lifted like a dark fog clearing at the break of dawn. Exhausted, Thomas slumped to the floor, the artifacts beside him inert and cold once more. The train slowed, its motion no longer the relentless, unstoppable force it had been. Through the windows the sky was returning to normal, the storm dissipating and the red clouds fading into the soft gray of a pre-dawn light. As the train pulled into what looked like a normal station, Thomas realized he was back in Elmview, the nightmarish journey seemingly over. But as he looked around, he knew nothing would ever be the same. The town looked different, darker, as if part of the shadow had seeped into the world with his return. Stepping off the train, Thomas felt the cool morning air on his face, a stark contrast to the stifling darkness of the train. He wondered if the entity was truly gone, or if he had merely opened the door to something far greater and more terrifying. As the sun rose over Elmview, casting long shadows on the ground, Thomas knew his battle might be over, but the war against the darkness might just have begun.